Here comes Sims. Pedaling into the paint, leaning and hitting a 10-0 run to start this game for Indiana. And Minnesota wants a timeout. Caitlin Clark knows it.
Is really the only reason the Indiana Fever can win games? That's the question fans, analysts, and critics have been asking all season long. But on a night when Clark wasn't even suited up, the Fever answered that question loudly and left no room for doubt. The Indiana Fever stormed into their matchup against the Minnesota Lynx and delivered a shocking 10-0 run right out of the gate. Think about that. A team missing 5 of its most important players didn't just survive. They imposed their will on one of the most physical teams in the WNBA. That early stretch wasn't just about scoring points, it was about sending a message. The Fever weren't intimidated, they weren't making excuses, and they weren't waiting for someone else to save them. They set the tone by diving for loose balls, attacking the rim, and playing defense with relentless intensity. The Lynx, a playoff-tested squad with a reputation for physicality, were stunned. You could feel it in the arena. The momentum, the confidence, the swagger, it was all tilting in Indiana's direction. And here's what makes this even more remarkable. Most teams in this situation would have crumbled under the weight of missing their superstar. But instead, the Fever showed they are more than just the Caitlin Clark show. They are a team rewriting their own story. In sports, sometimes the most powerful moments don't come from the scoreboard. They come from the locker room. After Indiana's stunning victory over the Lynx, all eyes turned to Kelsey Mitchell, the player carrying the torch in Caitlin Clark's absence. But instead of talking about her own points, her own stats, or even the win itself, Mitchell dropped 4 simple words that electrified her teammates. You've seen our growth. Think about that for a second. In a league obsessed with star power and highlight reels, Mitchell wasn't making it about herself. She was making it about the team. She was reminding everyone that what they've accomplished goes beyond one game or one player. These weren't empty words either. They were a declaration of identity. Indiana has been dismissed, doubted, and overshadowed by bigger names all season long. But with those words, Mitchell reframed the narrative. She positioned the Fever not as survivors clinging to scraps of momentum, but as a group on the rise, battle-tested, growing, and hungry for more. Her message resonated because it wasn't about pretending things have been easy. It was about acknowledging the adversity, the injuries, the lineup shuffles, and saying, look at us now. We've turned it all into fuel. That's leadership. That's the heartbeat of a franchise. And that's why this Indiana team suddenly looks less like an underdog and more like a contender stepping into its moment. Let's be clear, what the Indiana Fever pulled off should have been impossible. 5 rotation players sidelined. Caitlin Clark, Sophie Cunningham, Sydney Colson, Chloe B, and Ari McDonald. That's not just a dent in the roster, that's half the engine ripped out of the car. Most teams in the WNBA, facing that level of attrition, would have folded, packed their bags, and chalked up the season as a loss. But not this group. Instead of crumbling, Indiana reinvented themselves right in the middle of the season. They didn't sit around waiting for Clark's return to bail them out. They looked inward and decided to adapt. What does that adaptation look like? It's role players stepping into starring moments. It's reserves playing with the urgency of seasoned veterans. It's a coaching staff retooling game plans on the fly, asking players to do things they haven't been asked to do all year. The result? 3 straight wins against some of the toughest competition in the league. Think about the turnaround. This was a team that had lost 4 of its last 5 games and looked like its playoff dreams were slipping away. Doubt was everywhere, among fans, among analysts, maybe even within the locker room itself. And yet, instead of surrendering, the Fever clawed their way back, proving that adversity doesn't have to destroy a team, it can define it. This is the kind of resilience that builds culture, the kind that echoes for seasons to come. When the season seemed ready to collapse, one voice cut through the noise. Head coach Stephanie White. Her mantra, be where your feet are. On the surface, it sounds simple, but in the chaos of losing star players, reshuffling lineups, and facing constant doubt, those words became a lifeline. White challenged her team to stop worrying about what they didn't have. No Caitlin Clark, no Sophie Cunningham, no Coulson, no McDonald, and instead, focus on who was available. Every player had a role, every possession mattered, and every moment on the floor was an opportunity. That philosophy kept the Fever grounded. Instead of spiraling into panic about injuries or future matchups, they anchored themselves in the present. It wasn't about the next week, it was about the next play. You saw it in the hustle for loose balls, in the way veterans and newcomers alike trusted each other on defense, and in the way the offense never looked stagnant, even with so many stars missing. White's approach wasn't just about surviving the regular season, it was about building a culture of resilience. She reminded her players that basketball is about persistence. You get knocked down, you get back up, and through that, she gave them a new identity. Not a team defined by injuries or excuses, but one defined by relentless fight. That's why this Fever squad suddenly looks like it has a future much bigger than anyone imagined. One of the easiest traps in professional basketball is leaning too heavily on a single star. That's why so many people believed the Fever were doomed without Caitlin Clark. But against Minnesota, Indiana proved they're not a one-woman show. They're a collective force. The box score told the story, 5 different players finishing in double figures. That's not luck. That's a statement. It means defenses can't just lock in on one player and expect the Fever's offense to stall. It means every person who touches the floor is capable of swinging momentum. You saw veterans crashing the boards with grit, reserves sacrificing their bodies for loose balls, and role players stepping into shots with complete confidence. This wasn't an offense that lived and died on isolation plays or one hot hand. It was fluid, it was unselfish, and it was dangerous from multiple angles. The defense mirrored that balance. Guards fought over screens, wings switched seamlessly, and the bigs protected the paint like it was sacred territory. What emerged was a brand of basketball that felt less like desperation and more like evolution. The Fever didn't just survive without their stars, they showcased a depth and versatility that makes them unpredictable heading into the playoffs. And in a league where scouting reports and matchups decide games, unpredictability is a weapon. This is no longer a team that relies on Clark to save them. This is a team that believes in each other, top to bottom. If there was one player who turned Indiana's front court into a nightmare for the Lynx, it was Aliyah Boston. Forget the idea of her being just a paint presence. Boston showed she's so much more. She tied her own rebounding record, swallowing up every loose ball like it belonged to her. But it wasn't just about number. Every time she touched the ball, the Lynx defense bent, sometimes breaking under the weight of her skill set. Boston forced double teams, and when that happened, she turned into a playmaker, finding shooters on the perimeter, opening driving lanes, and making the Fever's offense flow through the post like a guard in a center's body. It's rare to see a player who can dominate physically and orchestrate tactically, but Boston has reached that level. What makes her impact even bigger is the timing. Without Caitlin Clark to stretch defenses, Indiana needed a focal point inside, someone who could steady possessions and force Minnesota to adjust. Boston embraced that responsibility fully, not just scoring but dictating tempo. Her coast-to-coast steal and layup wasn't just a highlight, it was a declaration that she's capable of carrying this team when called upon. In many ways, Boston has become the heartbeat of Indiana's identity. Tough, intelligent, and unrelenting. Her performance against Minnesota proved that the Fever don't just have stars, they have a cornerstone, a franchise anchor who will define their rise for years to come. Every championship-caliber team has that one moment when the bench transforms from background players into headline makers. For the Indiana Fever, that moment came against the Minnesota Lynx. With Caitlin Clark and other stars sidelined, the pressure was on the reserves, and they responded with fire. Odyssey Sims, long considered past her prime by some critics, came off the bench and delivered 15 points with the kind of confidence that only comes from experience. She controlled possessions, hit timely shots, and gave Indiana a stabilizing force in the backcourt. Then came Aerial Powers, who hit back-to-back three-pointers in the second half that crushed Minnesota's momentum. Those 2 shots weren't just points, they were daggers, the kind of moments that silence an opposing crowd and ignite your own bench. And let's not forget Lexie Hull. Her defensive versatility was invaluable. She switched across multiple positions, contested shots against bigger forwards, and still chipped in offensively without needing plays drawn for her. That's the kind of glue player every winning team needs. These performances didn't just fill a stat sheet, they redefined Indiana's depth. The Fever proved they can lean on their bench for scoring burst, defensive stops, and energy when the starters need a lift. In the playoffs, depth is the great equalizer, and Indiana just showed the league they've got it in spades. What once looked like a weakness has now become one of their greatest strengths. Against Minnesota, she wasn't just a contributor, she was the closer, the leader, and the steady hand guiding a wounded roster. Dropping 17 points on efficient shooting, Mitchell controlled the game with her pace. She didn't just force shots, she created opportunities, reading the defense like a seasoned veteran, and punishing every mistake. But her brilliance goes beyond a single game. Over the course of this season, Mitchell has averaged career-high numbers, climbing into conversations that once seemed reserved for household names like Brianna Stewart and Aja Wilson. What sets her apart now isn't just her scoring, but her leadership. With Clark sidelined, Mitchell has embraced the challenge of being the focal point, carrying the offensive load while still finding her teammates in stride. She has elevated herself into the league's elite, not just by stats, but by her presence when she's on the floor. The Fever believe they can win. That belief has become contagious. Young players look to her as the example, the one who shows what it means to grind possession after possession, night after night. And if Indiana's playoff push succeeds, history may remember this season as the one where Kelsey Mitchell transitioned from star to legend. She's not just keeping the Fever afloat, she's redefining what this franchise can be. With Caitlin Clark injured, many expected Indiana to slide down the standings and limp into the offseason, at best. But this win over Minnesota flipped that narrative on its head. Not only did the Fever prove they could compete without their superstar, but they also showed they could win convincingly against a playoff-caliber team. That changes everything. Suddenly, Indiana isn't just fighting for survival. They're a legitimate threat. Their depth, their resilience, their ability to adjust under pressure, it all adds up to a squad that no opponent can afford to underestimate come playoff time. The victory also tightened the playoff race, putting pressure on rival teams like the Dream and the Mystics, who now realize Indiana won't be giving away ground easily. And for the Fever themselves, the psychological boost is massive. They've discovered that they can thrive without leaning solely on Clark, which means when she does return, they'll be even more dangerous. This game may very well be remembered as the moment Indiana stopped being seen as a rebuilding project and started being viewed as a legitimate postseason contender. And make no mistake, the rest of the league just felt the tremor. This win was more than a box score, more than a notch in the standings. It was an emotional jolt to a franchise and a fan base that has been starving for belief. For years, Indiana Fever supporters have lived through rebuilding seasons, heartbreaking losses, and the constant refrain of wait until next year. But against Minnesota, with their stars sidelined and the odds stacked high, this team gave its city something it hasn't felt in a long time. You could see it in the faces of the fans at Gainbridge Fieldhouse. Every hustle play drew standing ovations. Every big shot had the crowd shaking the rafters. It wasn't just about basketball, it was about identity. This victory told the Fever faithful that their team isn't just surviving, they're evolving into something worth rallying around. And for the players, it was validation. Young athletes, like Boston and Hull, now understand that they're part of something bigger than themselves. Veterans like Kelsey Mitchell see that their years of grinding are paying off. Even for Caitlin Clark, watching from the sidelines, this win reinforced that she doesn't carry this burden alone. The cultural ripple effect is profound. A locker room bonded tighter, a fan base reunited, and a franchise finally stepping into a new chapter. In many ways, this wasn't just a victory, it was a rebirth. And for Indiana, it might be the spark that lights the fire of a new dynasty.